Okay, let's start. Так, уважаемые
Distinguished delegates, distinguished visitors, I'm not sure what is better for me to sit down or to stand up. But maybe I'll start standing up so that everybody can see us. Well, today we have a very interesting topic, public-private partnerships. Right now, I live in Singapore, but I used to live in Moscow, so I had the first-hand opportunity to witness how everything was being developed in Russia. So if we talk about Southeast Asia, then of course a lot of achievements that were done. But today we have a very interesting lineup of speakers, starting from Vladimir Yefimov from the Moscow City government, Jürgen Gerke, Sergei Kerber, Maxim Tkachenko, Evgeny Trusov, and Vadim Tsudikman. So I welcome all of you. So our first speaker, Maxim, over to you. So good afternoon, dear colleagues. I would like to thank the organizers for actually finding the time for such a topic. It is quite uncharacteristic for large agglomerations which have an opportunity to utilize larger budgets and to, but you know, how we attract investors. This is something that is not just related to the budgets, but to a lot of competences. So basically, our P3 Center is one of the institutes that acts as an aggregate of this practice in Russia. So we work on these projects, and I would like to tell you about certain particulars that relate to this project, how it is integrated into worldwide trends. So this is something that I will try to cover in my speech today. The only thing is I don't think the clicker is working. So we have 3,500 projects, P3 projects that are being implemented in Russia, concessional agreements, investment agreements, life cycle contracts, corporate contracts. So we tried to designate the projects which relate to large urban agglomeration. There are about 162 projects, which is slightly over 5%, but the overall volume of investments in these projects is 50% of all of the investments into P3 projects in Russia. What is interesting here is that when we talk about large urban sprawls, we are talking about different industries. So in Russia, more than 80% of all of the projects are projects that are related to household utilities. This is very specific to Russia. That was because we moved from centralized heat and water supply systems. So we are moving to actually transferring all of the systems into concessional agreements. So right now, we have more than 3,000 projects that are related to household utilities. This topic is not so topical for urban agglomerations because, again, water supply or heat supply is managed by quasi-governmental shareholders. So it is a well-established business. And of course, a lot of the projects in large agglomerations are either related to social infrastructure or transportation, which is not so surprising. But in a number of large cities, such as Volgograd, Voronezh, Izhevsk, and others, well, we have examples where private investors participate in household utilities, and we think that a new boom in concessional agreements will mostly relate to sewage systems. You know that these systems, basically the state of these systems leaves much to be desired. I have to tell you that even in Cairo, there was a recent example of signing concessional agreements for water treatment facilities. If we use relative figures, then we have 4.5 times more projects in social sphere and in the transportation area. And this is probably related to the factors that I'll talk about on the next slide. So we try to compare actually what is the average time, what is the average investment volume, what is the average share of private funding in large urban agglomerations and other cities of Russia. So we compared federal projects to municipal projects. For instance, federal projects related to large highways and municipal projects were related to large agglomerations. And I think this is the main points of our session is that large agglomerations are trusted more. That relates to higher salaries and also to the fact that people are ready to pay for better services in infrastructure. Doesn't matter whether it's a social service, IT service, or if it's a high-speed toll road. And that also influences a number of parameters. As you can see, the average term of a concessional agreement is 19 years. Other agreements, the average term is 11 years. The average cost of investment is 8.3 billion for agglomerations and 500 million for projects all over Russia. So again, the infrastructure itself, we all understand that in smaller or medium-sized cities, infrastructure is not something that brings money, but of course we have to use budget leverage. And again, this is a cornerstone for regional budgets. When it comes to larger agglomerations, this issue is not so important. For 1 ruble spent out of the budget, we have 4 rubles which come from private investment, but in other projects we have about a 50-50 ratio, which tells us that investors are ready to trust this model, which puts consumers on the top. So basically here we have to work on restructuring it. But in a lot of smaller cities in Russia, we have to get budgetary or public funding, and the volume of this funding is up to 80%. What is also quite interesting is that when we talk about smaller cities, then concessional agreements or P3 agreements are viewed as more reliable than rental agreements. Our investors do not really have a lot of trust in the governments and the public partners, so they see concessional agreements as something that gives them more protection, because rental agreements, they might be changed, or the rules of the game can be changed in the future. So what this gives us is these quasi P3 agreements, such as investment agreements or lifestyle agreements. Well, the share of these contracts is less than 10% in smaller cities, but when it comes to large agglomerations, investors are not so averse to risk. They are ready to enter into life cycle contracts, in long-term investment contracts, and even in rental contracts. All of these signs are basically the signs of trust that investors have in large agglomerations. Another important trend, and this is basically a trend that goes in reverse to the previous trend, but we have to say that large agglomerations have larger budgets. Investors trust these partners more, especially when it comes to mechanisms of getting return on their investments from public spending. So basically, we have fixed installments from the budget, which are not related to consumers at all. So you see that in larger agglomerations, the share of these contracts is 3 times higher than all over Russia. And the share of projects with minimal returns, again, tells us that investors are much bolder than in other regions of Russia, because, again, we have more of these projects in large agglomerations than across the country. So these are the figures that we've gathered for Russia overall, but the organizers also asked me to compare international trends and Russian trends. Of course, I will not be original when I say that the most basic trend that we see in the world right now when it comes to communal infrastructure is digitalization of the existing infrastructure. But I think that it has 2 components. We are using digital technologies in infrastructure itself. For instance, basically the video cameras and so on and so forth. So that's a photograph the license plates where we're speeding. So these projects are underway in about 15 large cities.
And now we can see that it is not the equipment which is competing with each other, but it is rather a solution, like, for example, a software solution which has better data processing capability or which can provide better reporting options. So that sort of digitization is one of the rising trends for the city utilities. And apart from them, IT can be an object of this process, not the subject of it. Like recently in Barcelona, in Spain, all IT infrastructure, which is used by public authorities, is currently being centralized. So we also debate an option of centralization of accounting, of HR accounting in our public bodies, so that, let's say, we can have some cloud solutions. So we see the move from outsourcing to PPP through, which is fostered by IT solutions. And 3 weeks ago, in databases, geoinformational system can act as subjects of concession. And I think we are moving ahead of the world here. And next year will be the year of PPPs and digital projects. And also we see examples when PPP is being used for large infrastructural projects, for resettlement project. And among recent examples, we can name Rio de Janeiro, the port area, which is being redeveloped based on the PPP principle. Based on the specificity of the Russian development market, we are lagging slightly behind, and there is not a lot of overlap of PPP and developers' interests. There is an overlap when a developer needs to create some social infrastructure like schools or kindergartens, but we don't see a lot of cooperation among developers and PPPs, whereas there are good examples in international, like in Ireland, for example. Thank you very much, Maxim. You have a lot of interesting observations, and now we keep talking about PPP, and let's give a floor to Moscow government, where Moscow government is ready to use PPPs. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. And indeed, I would say that PPP for Moscow is one of important tools of drawing investment in. So I will probably disagree with Maxim, who says that large cities who possess large financial resources invest them on their own, and they invest their own money. Not necessarily so. Investment in city infrastructure is important, of course, and city investment is important, and the role of private investors is important as well. However, the number of projects which are currently underway in Moscow will be merely unthinkable without involving private investment. And this private investment flows in based on the PPP principles. Talking about Moscow's investment policy, I would say that Moscow authorities are fairly active in this area. We are trying to make sure that we invest as much as possible in infrastructure, since if infrastructure is boosting economic growth in the city and is boosting private projects. And based on previous years, we can see that 1 ruble invested into infrastructure brings 3 rubles of return in private investment. Maxim mentioned that PPP is not very much effective in large cities, but in general, our efficiency is 1 to 3, which is fairly good. And one of our priorities in our investment policy is transportation infrastructure, because that creates points of growth. And we have a number of PPP projects in construction of transportation hub. In more than 30 points of growth have been created on the Moscow Circle Railroad, and 16 have already been completed, and using private investors' money for the total amount of 1 trillion rubles. So the city is giving them a land, a site, and they build infrastructure on it. This infrastructure comprises transportation hubs. So those points where people change over from one transport to another. And if we take a general look at how PPPs work in Moscow, then we'll see that we actively use all options which are left open by the legislation, like co-financing or providing co-financing or running a project on the basis of pledging some governmental property. And the overall, we have signed contracts for more than 700 billion rubles now, and that amount is reflected in the rating Moscow currently enjoys. And private investment goes into the utilities business mostly, but we have prioritized transport infrastructure over the utilities. So we also have life cycle contracts in the transportation infrastructure area, and we just start expanding our business in the utilities area, and we know that there is a room for improvement in terms of getting more private money in there. If we talk about the measures which are most popular among the investors, is they can create a social site, or they can restore a historically significant building, and then they can rent it almost for free. So we have got more than 50 billion rubles on that basis from private investors, and the private investors are building and recreating buildings, creating value for the city. And offset contracts. It's like a long-term contract with the state, which has reciprocal liabilities. So under this contract, an investor is to create a facility, and then this facility needs to starts functioning and starts producing products. And currently, we saw to more than 3 billion rubles being invested into the building of a pharmaceutical factory capable of producing more than 20 different types of drugs. But the key effect was not about it. The key economic effect came from signing this long-term contract, because we managed to get more than 50% discount on that, and it translates into more than 4 billion of saving, 4 billions of savings over the course of 1 year. So critics tend to say that city has a lot of purchasing power, so Moscow can easily win against any other region of Russia. So this is why it is easier to lure investors in. But when we have new businesses, that means more jobs and more taxes. But when we talk about high-tech industries, like a large factory with over 5,000 square meters will have less than, let's say, 100 people, because the production is fully automated. So you only have shift operators to run it. So from the tax perspective, the tax amount will also not be very large, simply because normally these projects are implemented in some tax-free areas. So the city pays for utilities, and however, the total amount which we save is incomparable with the amount of the micro revenues which can be generated by the production side. But more importantly, no other region was capable of getting this discount. And Moscow accounts for less than 30% of drug consumption in Russia. So we have saved 4 billion, and now we have reference prices, and thanks to these reference prices for these medications, for these drugs, the entire country has reference prices. So the entire country is saving money, reducing the cost for purchasing, the cost of for purchasing drugs. Now these drugs are manufactured here domestically, and we believe that future belongs to these offset contracts. However, these offset contracts need to be signed with high-tech companies as well, where we have a lot of competitive edge as a city. And the company which wins this contract has to seize exporting drugs as one of its priorities, and it can export drugs simply because they have very modern production lines. So building a cable cart, another important project. You may be forgiven for thinking that it's a very small-time project. So the cable cart line, it's more about entertainment rather than a transportational link. But we looked deeper into this together with our colleagues from the transportational department, and we realized that this is probably one of the most significant transportational projects in the city. It will help to cut the travel time from 45 minutes to 7 for particular commuters. And we believe that this project will be completed in 3 years from now. And talking about other options, we realize that we'll keep focusing on transportation infrastructure, we'll keep focusing on social infrastructure. We have a number of projects in the medical cluster, which are currently underway in Moscow, and we hope that international medical pharmaceutical company will participate and bring new technologies in. And the city is ready to finance these projects, and there are good examples of such cooperation. For example, we build a building, or we put the box, and then the box is filled by a partner, filled with equipment and so on. So we hope that this active investment policy, which Moscow carries out, will translate into higher growth in Moscow. And I'd like to repeat myself. Even though Moscow has a lot of, let's say, purchasing power, the efficiency in this area depends on how closely we work together with private investors. So we either work with them on a PPP basis, or we deliver projects which were unthinkable had we done this alone. Like, for example, renewing our rolling stock in the subway. We are using those new rail cars now, but we have hardly paid more than 30% for this, because this is a life cycle contract under which we can pay by installment. And that contract is more efficient because manufacturer maintain this equipment. But had we been doing this only through using our budget money, we would be able to buy 30% of what we have now. So PPPs is one of a priority for Moscow government, and we'll keep expanding it. Thank you. And now, let's take a look from a side to the same situation. I would like you to memorize 3 figures. 3 figures. The first figure is something which is difficult to think about. It's a figure of $100 billion. $100 billion. This is the total cost or total amount of PPP deals. So a lot of these deals are about building up transportational infrastructure, but this is just a starting point. So PPPs are also very popular in utilities areas in all cities across the globe. 20 and 30 years ago, transportation was city transport was extremely important. And I can hardly imagine that amount of money, 100 billion. And I'd like to give you an example, which you are probably not aware of. So, Manila. Manila is a capital of Philippines with 25 million inhabitants, and its population is growing at 10% a year, and they have a problem with drinking water. They failed to resolve it on their own, and after decades of unsuccessful attempts, they decided to hand it over to a third-party operator, and they were astonished to see the performance. The operator is about to extend this contract for another 20 years. They built a bond market around this. They're building up their experience of handling it on this basis, and they are trying to export this experience to other Asian countries. So that's a very interesting example, and Moscow needs to look closer at it. A second example comes from city transport area. It's from Hong Kong. This is not to say they didn't have enough time. They didn't have enough time, not money. They wanted to build a city subway network very quickly, and they thought that the third-party operator will be better at it. So they signed a very complex deal with a city developer. So they were building, and they managed to build a number of subway stations very, very quickly. And everyone is looking at this example now. And the final example, which sets a perspective for PPP, saying that they have future not only in transportation, city transport area or infrastructure, or it's prisons. In the United States, you can become a prison operator. It's quite an interesting business. I'm not suggesting that we should introduce this practice in Russia, but investment is about investing money and getting returns. So in the United States, that's an extremely interesting business from the return perspective. And now I'm asking Sergei Kerber to tell us about his take on this, but not about prisons, no. Good afternoon, dear colleagues, and I represent a leader management company, and I think we are the largest concession operator, which also uses pension financing from pension funds. So currently we have more than 15 concession projects underway in a number of regions across the Russian Federation. So we have contract relations with Moscow authorities and with other regions of Russia, and we currently have got more than 100 million of investment in a number of these projects. And now this money is being used fully in line with the international trend regarding PPP development. We invest in transportation infrastructure. We invest in upgrading water supply networks and water discharge networks. We have a number of projects in the area of processing household waste, and we also have a number of projects focused on building socially significant facilities like medical centers and sports installations. And this is what we are doing today. And based on what previous speakers mentioned, I can say that whatever is happening in Russia is fully in line with the international trend. And the international trend goes as follows. The recent tenders which took place in the world, they just confirm this trend, like subway lines, motorways, railways. These are the key areas where PPP finds its business. But there is a number of other areas which are just gaining traction.
For instance, a tender in London for 4.5 billion pounds for water treatment and sewage removal, also university campuses, transportation hubs, and recycling. What's also important is that PPP projects are not so easy to implement. We have to find a balance of interests, both for the private partner and for the government, so we cannot really implement them when we're talking about small-scale projects. So usually when we talk about P3 projects, that mostly these are projects that call for a large volume of investment where all of the partners can actually make sure that they find a right balance of interests. So why do we do this? I think that the main objective when it comes to development of P3 models is basically that we're trying to increase the funding which had been traditionally provided by the government by attracting private investors. So we have to make sure that a private partner has a vested financial interest in the success of the project. For instance, if we're building a toll road, if we're collecting money from the population, then we have to make sure that such a toll road provides a quality service 24/7. Well, today, I have to tell you that we are running a toll road going around the town of Odintsovo, and up until now, we had no problems when it came to road repairs and a major rehauling of asphalt, despite the fact that sometimes when we implement these projects using government funding, we do run into problems when it comes to funding the repairs. So P3 models allow us to shift some of the funding to the private partner and also allows us to find the funding promptly. Another problem when it comes to P3 models in Russia and in the world is implementation of non-standard interdisciplinary solutions when we have both commercial and non-commercial elements in the same functions. For instance, the fuel and production complexes or the creation of transportation infrastructure, which allows us to use private funding to create additional services for the passengers, to expand the transportation network. It allows the government to decrease the volume of government investment while simultaneously increasing the efficiency of the transportation network and utilizing the land resources efficiently. We have to make sure that the transportation infrastructure is fully and efficiently integrated into urban infrastructure. We have to make sure that we effectively use every square inch of the lands. For instance, in San Francisco, the main rail hub is a public square, and you do not actually see any trains there because the actual rail terminal is located underground as well as overground, and it creates a multi-model system that contributes to comfort in mass transit. And the third thing, which is also important, is that concessional agreements allow us to attract external financing. They allow us to decrease the budget on the strain on public spending. We can draw a clear line between the responsibilities of the government and the responsibilities of the project itself, so we can provide return on investment utilizing economic functions of any project. And that also makes long-term funding a bit easier. When we are talking about construction of a toll road, it allows a city, even if the city government finances a significant part of construction cost, it allows the city to transfer a large amount of funding to a private operator, because it's one thing to build a toll road, but it's another thing to run it and to maintain it. The run and maintenance costs sometimes exceed the cost of construction. And even when we attract even a small volume of private investment, it also contributes to the optimization of public spending when it comes to any project. So these global trends, which we're witnessing all over the world, are continued in Moscow, and Moscow here is spearheading the global efforts, and we do hope that our cooperation with the Moscow city government will continue. Thank you very much. And Ratzlav would like to give the floor to one of the largest international investors. I learned that Jürgen is here with us today, and tomorrow he's meeting the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic. Well, the volumes of these deals are so huge that it is interesting for private.
Interesting for you to invest.
Thank you, Wojciech. Yeah, first of all, maybe spend 30 seconds to tell you who we are, as sort of we are not a Russian company. I'm sorry also that I have to speak English. My Russian is almost non-existing. I try to learn one word per day, but as I'm there for 4 days, that I haven't got very far. So Allianz is a big insurance and asset management group, and we are present in almost 100 countries of the world. We are one of the world market leaders, and we manage today about 2 trillion euros assets under management. Just to put it in perspective, that's about twice the size of the GDP of Russia. And that is globally. And then 2/3 of that are managed out of the US, PIMCO, that's a fixed income business, which is sovereign debt or private debt. And then you have 1/3 that is our own money. It's about 650 billion. And that money is invested across the whole world. And in that, we also have a little bit of what we call alternative. And alternative is private equity for us. So private equity is what my company does. Allianz Capital Partners is the private equity firm. We run 25 billion assets under management today. We're very small, it's 130 people. And also asset-wise, we are not in the first league. We're probably in the second league, but we hope to go up in the first league at some point in time very soon. In that 25 billion, we have 1/3 that's real private equity. We run private equity out of Shanghai, Singapore, New York, and Munich, and it's a global business. And then the other 2/3 is what we call infrastructure business. In that infrastructure, again, we're running it out of Munich and London. Infrastructure has 1/3 of energy production that is exclusively renewable energy, so solar and wind. We are the biggest financial investor worldwide in solar and wind. So we could almost cover the Moscow energy demand actually today. The other 2/3 are core infrastructure projects. And the infrastructure project, I heard a couple, Sergey mentioned a couple of them, which we know. We cluster them in 3 buckets. Bucket number 1 is energy. So we have energy production. We talked about this. This is exclusively renewable. We don't do any, nuclear or coal or oil or something like that. That's not our business. We also do energy transmission and energy distribution. And we do that in many countries in Europe, especially Norway, the UK, in Spain, in Finland, in Romania, in the Czech Republic, in Austria, and some others. The second bucket is transport. You said it. Transport is probably, in the infrastructure sector, the name of the game today. It's the hottest place to be. It's very contested, it's very competitive. And infrastructure transportation for us is, for instance, we own the rolling stock in the UK rail. We own more than 50% of the highway network in Italy. We own the metro systems of Barcelona and Madrid. And that is the typical stuff. We should also own airports, but we don't, because we have never succeeded in buying one because the competition was so hard. Currently we're working on 3 different airport projects. I hope this year we're going to make it. But that is something that is certainly one of the most interesting sectors to develop, and I personally love it because my first projects when I started 30 years ago was Sheremetyevo Airport here, and then Beijing and Athens, and Warsaw actually were the first. So then the third bucket is what we call urban. That is largely utility based. So we own, for instance, with the lead investor in the London Super Sewer, the Thames Tideway, the £4.5 billion project. That has very nice features, very interesting, but we also own the water supply, so the fresh water supply of London. We have, for instance, the UK garrisons, so it's the Royal Air Force Quick Intervention Force in Colchester. This is the biggest air base in the UK, which they used in the Second World War to bombard Germany. So just out of revenge, I think we bought that just to stop them from doing it after they do the Brexit. But this is a mixed bag of things. We could also do hospitals or universities, which we haven't done, and other sort of close to the citizen projects. So you will note we have never done anything in Russia. And there are some good reasons for it and some bad reasons for it, but we have never done that. We certainly would like to do that at some point in time. I think it's a question of maturity of the market, of maturity of our understanding of the market, but also of maturity of my organization, because we have only been launching our activity really over the last 4 years. So that before that was fairly small. And now with that increased speed, we're doing 5 to 6 billion investment per year. We also need to go beyond Europe, and we have done the first projects in Hong Kong, in China, in India, in the US. We own a couple of highways also in the US, and we're looking to Latin America, and of course Russia is also one of our targets. Now when we go into such a market, we try to keep it really simple, because these projects are very difficult as they are long-term and pretty complex and big. So we try to focus ourselves on keeping it simple. So we focus on 4 essential clusters of interest. Cluster number 1 is the choice of the asset. When we buy an asset, it goes again. When we buy an asset, we want to have a real asset. We don't want to have just a right of something. We want to have the asset itself. Can be a concession, can be a freehold, but we want to have it long term, and we need to do the future check. So when we sit together and decide upon do we do the asset or don't we do it, we think, what are the children of our children in that circumstance going to think of that asset? So is that asset going to be adding value to the citizens? And I very, very much liked the opening remarks this morning of Mayor Sobyanin, and yesterday I met him actually, and he had more or less the same pitch. The people first, okay? So if a environment, a city, a country does not like the stuff you do, you better don't do it. Good example is nuclear power in Germany. Some decades ago, nuclear was the name of the game in Germany. Engineering, everybody loved it. Today, we're out of nuclear. We're getting out of nuclear. So let's assume we had invested in nuclear 30 years ago, would have been the kings 30 years ago. Today, the money would be lost. I think we need to be very, very careful in picking the assets. And there has always to pass this future test. What is the value add for the citizen around that asset in some 40, 50 years? That is also because we are, and that's a bucket number 2, we are what we call a buy and hold investor. So many of the funds that you probably, Sergey, deal with are funds who put the asset in sort of a vehicle, and then they have to sell it after 10 to 15 years. And then another buyer buys it. We don't do that. We buy the asset and we keep it. So the longest concession we own is actually Thames Tideway. It's a 120-year concession. Then we have some other concessions, 75 years. The average is beyond 40 years. So we commit today to be there in more than 40 years on average. And we don't want to get out. We want to have the concession as long as it possibly goes. For renewable, the concession time is a little bit shorter, it's about 30 years, 28, 30 years average. And for private equity, obviously, it's shorter, it's between 10 and 15. But that being said, is we are a buy and hold investor that wants not to sell the asset anymore. So we want to be linked to the fate of the asset. That allows us to finance over a long period of time. And we also need to make sure that we are a minority investor, which also distinguishes us from many competitors who wants the majority. Like our friend from Vinci we met here, they always go for the majority because from a balance sheet point of view, they need to consolidate the asset, and we just don't want to do this. For us, it's just a mere investment. So minority investor is something that pleases countries or cities or governments because they can keep control. But we want to have a sizable stake, of course. And the third bucket we're looking at is how safe and secure is the asset. So is the legal system transparent? Is it reliable? Is it predictable? Are the economic surroundings okay? What about the currency? What about government action? Is the government open to this kind of business or isn't it open? So Germany, for instance, I can tell you, I'm German national, is completely hostile to PPPs and anything of private money in public services. France is just the opposite. The UK has gone even the extra mile, and I think also Russia is much more modern than Germany will ever be. So it depends really on the country. You have to pick and choose. And the last point is, when we look at that, we have to make sure that we get the money for our client back. So our client could be you or you or you. When I, for instance, got my second child, I bought her a life insurance policy in France. I lived in France at that point in time. And life expectancy for a young French girl born in 2007, as she was, is 90 plus years. So the company, Allianz, needs to be present 90 years down the road and honor the commitment to pay out on the life insurance policy. How do they do this possibly? They need very long-term assets. And the only thing I cannot tell my clients is, oh, sorry guys, I gambled, I lost your money. That's a no-go. Nobody expects from an insurance company to give them 20% return per year. But they want their money back. They want return off capital, and when they have the money back, then they want return on capital, but reasonable. And that means that for us, the prime interest is to have what we call a downside protected environment. We prefer an asset that is long-term and has a lower yield, but a reduced probability of losing our money, maybe with some buffers or some guarantees or so forth, over an asset that has a very high upside potential, very high promise of yield, but at the end of the day also very high risk. So whenever we have the choice, we go for the lower risk solution. And all of that combined, I think, is something that I've heard here today as well. So why would you ask, why don't we do then business? So I think for two reasons, apart from the fact that we had to learn a little bit. First of all, Russia doesn't really need us, because when you go as a private equity firm in infrastructure, you always have two angles. It's either lack of skill or lack of money. So obviously you have seen here, witness, that skill is abundantly available. You have all the necessary knowledge and skill. Money, you're rich enough. I mean, the country is rich enough. I think when you want to, I think you, Maxim, said it, you want to leverage your balance sheet, your budgets, your national budgets and city budgets, then we can be talking. So have in mind, our average size for tickets is something between 200 and 800 million euros for minority participation, which makes us probably eligible for very large assets. Thank you.
Speaking of balance sheet, let's hear some thoughts from banks, yeah? Because it's in the end on their balance sheet.
Спасибо. Трусов Евгений, представляю группу.
Thank you very much. Trusov Evgeny, I'm from the VTB Bank. I work with private equity investments into infrastructure, and it is quite fascinating for me to speak after all the last speakers. It's interesting to consider the statistics for the PPP markets. We view infrastructure concessions with a lot of interest. We are fascinated by what our colleagues are doing. I think that we learned a lot from one another. And of course, the viewpoint of an international investor about infrastructure as an asset with its particular characteristics, which can actually fit into investment strategies of insurance companies on pension funds, this low yield, low risk investment, this is something that is at the cornerstone of our investment strategy. That is how we select our assets. Last year, we celebrated our 10-year anniversary as part of VTB Bank.
And we had mandate to build up our capital and start going into infrastructure project. We build up a portfolio which is above 200 billion rubles. And that includes all sources of capital, our own money, debt. So we use a number of market instruments, loans, bonds, so all sorts of financial instruments which are available to an infrastructure investor now in our country. And we have 5 fairly large projects in our portfolio, and these projects are currently underway, close to completion, and we started with large investment into renovating the asset. Now we have taken the asset to the point of commissioning, and so these assets are currently operating, they are ramping up, and we can start selling them. Like, for example, we have investment into St. Petersburg Airport, and we wouldn't want to drop this investment. However, we face a target to ensure capital rotation, and we need to make a case in front of VTB shareholders saying that this investment is making money. However, we are happy about selling a part of our share in the St. Petersburg Airport, and we are happy to become a minority shareholder there. Previous speakers have already mentioned this. But what do I think, or we think, about the PPP market here in Russia? If we take a look at the size of the Russian economy and at the ratio of the number of projects and their cost, especially the projects which are being implemented on a concessional basis. And I would say these amounts are incomparable with what we see at mature market. We have GDP above $1 trillion, and at this level we want to see more private investment going into these concessional contracts focused on infrastructural development. The first wave of pilot projects which we saw was earlier, and we participated in these projects together with our colleagues from the Leader management company. So we expected the second wave to come as well. And the second wave, which we see now in terms of the number of projects, and there is a mix of large and smaller projects in there. So as you move down from the federal level to the regional level, these projects tend to shrink in size. However, the number of concessional projects is not very large. So, and this is a fairly mature market. So I would think that we need to have more concessions in this market. So there are lots of opportunities, and there are things which sort of impair our development. But market participants were concerned about the complex contract structure, about the big number of uncertainties, especially when you have a large construction project, and lack of competence. We started as a purely financial investor, so we were doing something very similar to what Allianz Group was doing. So we were looking for a good financial investment option. But when we realized that we need to expand our competence and to start going into construction management, operation management of these facilities. And this is how we started building up this experience. Now we have engineering units which have good experience in terms of operating toll roads. So These projects are very, let's say, very specific. And these projects require extra skills and extra competences, not similar to those which you need to just to implement a governmental contract. Because we are a private business. A private business is about making money. It is about making your budget, making your schedules, and making your deadlines. And we realized that only if we use our own competences and only if we work with bona fide contractors and investors, we will be in a position to manage these projects properly. Especially as far as projects in the investment stage are concerned, there is still fairly high risk of running the project over the budget or over the deadline. And if you have a huge overrun, if you don't manage this risk properly, you can kill the profitability of your project. So generally speaking, talking about this market in general, I can say that we have developed the required set of skills, and our colleagues and competitors developed their own skills. But we have an opportunity here, and this opportunity is linked to the fact that the cost of capital is going down in this country. And when our state customers think whether they should work on a concessional basis or not, there is always a trade-off. You need to think about whether you would like to invest it yourself or whether you would like to stick with a concessional opportunity. And this matter is far from being clear, but you need to compare the cost of capital for the state and the cost of capital for private investors. So the downward trend in terms of the cost of capital makes us think that these concessional projects will become increasingly profitable and increasingly more interesting to the state. So we'll be getting away from the situation when first you need to ensure the original amount or the initial amount of investment, and then you need to make sure that your investment brings return, and that pushes your profitability down. So we are gradually getting away from this, and this is a very important point. And this is the point which will define the future of the market. And I think we need to have more of these projects, and it is the state which needs to initiate these projects, because I think nothing prevents us from handling more projects. We have the competence, we have all the conditions in place, all the boxes are ticked, but we see that our state bodies are reluctant to go that way. I understand that it seems fairly complex, but it's a good opportunity to develop financial markets plus ensure achievement of our targets from the state development perspective. So we can ensure that we invest our pension funds with proper return, that our insurance companies have good investment opportunities. Thank you. So we've listened to the state officials, we've listened to people from the big business. Now, the most interesting part. We are in a gymnasium, and we operate educational institutions in cooperation with the Moscow government. We started to participate in this project 5 years ago. We were the first private organization to participate, and after 5 years, I can say that turned out to be a very good experience. We have got 15 square meters from Moscow to develop nursery gardens and kindergartens. All of these facilities are currently fully up and running, and we are fully utilizing this space. We have invested the required amount of money into development of these kindergartens, and now we are providing high-quality service, which is competing with state-run kindergartens. And even though we charge for this service, we compete with the state-run kindergartens fairly actively. So it is a good example of a PPP, and we are ready to continue. Thank you. I would like to thank all the speakers, and as far as I can see, people are moving in and out. So I'd like to thank you all for participating in this session, and I do hope that next year we'll hear that Mr. Gerke has invested its first amounts into Russian projects, and we'll see each other again in 1 year from now. Thank you.